When people say George Harrison was isolated by the Beatles, Paul McCartney, and John Lennon, I don't really buy it. Sure, he was a baby of the Beatles and took a little time to mature as a musician and songwriter, but I don't believe John and Paul had anything to do with not letting George get his songs out there. It was the record executives who had found a cash cow in Lennon and McCartney's songs, and they wasn't going to slow that down just to give George a chance. Right or wrong, fair or not, that's the way it was back then. They wasn't sure how long the Beatles would last, so while the money was rolling in, they weren't going to change a thing. This had nothing to do with how John and Paul felt about George and his songwriting. Now let's get right into this video and see if you agree with me or not. George Harrison was the youngest of the four Beatles. Throughout his career with them, he played guitar, sang, and wrote songs in the shadows of Lennon and McCartney. I guess some people can say he was pushed to the side because he didn't have as much talent and he was just there as a supporting cast. Maybe so. He was the baby of the band, so it would put him a year or two behind the others in his development. But through the years of growing up a Beatle, if you look a little closer at him, you can see George start to emerge into his own person. And when given the chance to step out, George was ready. I don't find it surprising at all that George Harrison was the first Beatle to release a #1 song and album after the Beatles' breakup. You could see it coming if you look back close enough. Like George himself said, "I didn't have many tunes on Beatles records, so doing an album like All Things Must Pass was like going to the bathroom and letting it out." One reason people might think John and Paul put George in the shadows, they had been writing together for a few years already. They had quite a bit of material started, and when the opportunity arose, they were ready. And another reason George didn't get the chance was the cigar smokers higher up had a product that was making them big money, and they wasn't going to rock the boat or try and fix something that wasn't broke at that time. One thing for sure is, George was paying attention and working on his songs all during this time. He usually wrote alone, but I'm sure when they had the time, John and Paul gave him advice. He did get a few cuts on an album once in a while. George wrote 22 songs on his own that made it on Beatles albums, out of the 180 or so original songs recorded for him. His earlier material was good. Maybe not great, but they was good solid songs, like Taxman and If I Needed Someone. You could hear him starting to develop. Some of the songs that made up his All Things Must Pass album, like Isn't It a Pity, Let It Down, and Hear Me Lord, and the title song All Things Must Pass, were among the songs that he had routinely overlooked when picking songs for Beatles albums. At the end of the Beatles' run together, George did get the songs Here Comes the Sun and Something onto the Abbey Road album. The song Something was to become the second most covered Beatles song, just behind Yesterday. Frank Sinatra said that Something was the best written love song the Beatles ever recorded. George first auditioned for the Quarrymen, later to become the Beatles, in 1958 at 15 years old. It took a little more time, just hanging around to get him in, and Paul talking to John, who thought George was a bit young for them. But soon George was the guitarist for the group, and at 17 years old he headed out to Hamburg, Germany with the group and really started to cut his teeth mastering the guitar. George worked himself into a good guitarist during these early years, also started singing lead vocals on some songs. Paul also helped George to learn to sing harmony. Back in those days, you really had to be on your toes and have a good ear to sing harmony, as there was no such things as monitors. Most of the time, they were lucky to have a PA system for some gigs. But either way, George learned and became a very good lead singer and harmony singer. By the time the Beatles returned from their first United States trip in February of 1964, They were put under the gun to get new material out, and Lennon and McCartney worked the magic again with the Hard Day's Night album, sealing the deal to what was working and selling. So again, George, who really started to get serious about songwriting around this time, was left behind. We have to remember here that at this time in the Beatles' career, nobody knew how long this would last. So everyone was in a hurry to make as much as they could and do it quickly. The Lennon-McCartney team was putting out hits, and as I said, the big boys upstairs was not going to let that change. Their producer George Martin was told by his bosses to keep doing what was working, and he did. So really George Harrison's fate was pretty much sealed, and although he was allowed to get a few songs on some of the albums to come later, he had to really fight and kiss ass to get him a cut on one. But after John and Paul decided to walk away from the Beatles, George was free to do the same, and he had a backlog of many great songs just waiting to record. When they started the serious recording on the All Things Must Pass album, George brought in a lot of players to work with him on it. Some really great musicians. Of course, his closest Beatle friend Ringo was there, along with Billy Preston, steel guitarist Pete Drake, and a very young Peter Frampton, who was quoted as saying, "This was the greatest time ever." Then there was members of the group Badfinger, and some of the members of Delaney and Bonnie's group. Other players included Jim Gordon, Carl Rattle, Bobby Whitlock, and Eric Clapton, who all four ended up forming Derek and the Dominoes while participating in these sessions. Even old friend and bodyguard Mal Evans played some percussion, and the list could go on, but you get the idea. George had some of the best in there working on this album. The album was produced by George himself, along with Phil Spector. Although I like a lot of the songs Spector produced, I could have done without his wall of sound on a few of the cuts from George's album, but that's just me. Either way, the album, even today, is considered one of the best post-Beatle albums released, and many consider it the best. A few music historians have even mentioned this album in the same breath as Sgt. Pepper's. That says a lot. If you haven't listened to the album All Things Must Pass, you should. Even if you're not a big Beatles or a George Harrison fan, you need to. Just for the fact of hearing a very well-produced album with some of the best-written songs of that era on it. Maybe things worked out best for George Harrison in the long run. From what we know about him, I'm sure he found good in his being the youngest Beatle and having to wait for his time to step out in the light. Because when he did, he lit up the rock world with this album, All Things Must Pass.